got the grandkids in tow. When you start thinking about that, and Zipporah and the kids are coming out to meet Moses at Mount Sinai, we start thinking about that, and we think about, Zipporah holding to the boys' hands and walking them out to go meet their father and catch up with him. But we have to remember some things when we start thinking about how this story actually looks in reality. First off, Moses is not my age. Moses is 80 years old. The other thing is, Moses' kids are closer to my age than Moses would have been, because his kids were actually probably in the range of minimum probably 35 years old. So Moses' kids are not coming out holding their mama's hand unless mama just can't walk by herself through the sand outside of Mount Sinai. So we realize that all of a sudden, wait a minute, this isn't just this, this young family being reunited. This is an older family that's connecting and reconnecting. And here is the catch. Moses may have had grandchildren of his own that were coming with Gershom and Eleazar and Zipporah. And so they may have been married possibly themselves. But we do know that Gershom and Eleazar both had children of their own, because we read about them in 1 Chronicles chapter 23. We read about Moses' grandkids there. And so they're recorded. We just don't know if they're alive at this point yet or not. So Moses' family and his father-in-law traveled from Midian to Mount Sinai to meet up with Moses. And Jethro sent word to Moses sort of ahead of time to let him know that they were on their way to meet him there at Mount Sinai. And that's where we pick up in verses 7 through 12, finding that Jethro and his group of his family, the party that's with him, meets or arrives and meets Moses. It says, follow along with me in your Bibles, beginning in verse 7. It says, so Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down, and then kissed him. They asked each other how they had been and went into the tent. Moses recounted to his father-in-law all that the Lord had done to Pharaoh and the Egyptians for Israel's sake, all the hardships that confronted them on the way, and how the Lord rescued them. Jethro rejoiced over all the good things the Lord had done for Israel when he rescued them from the power of the Egyptians. Blessed be the Lord, Jethro exclaimed, who rescued you from the power of Egypt and from the power of Pharaoh. He has rescued the people from under the power of Egypt. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods, because he did wonders when the Egyptians acted arrogantly against Israel. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought a burnt offering and sacrifices to God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in God's presence. So when Jethro arrived at Mount Sinai, Moses met him, and he showed him great respect, and he bowed in front of him and did all of that. Now we have to remember, we're probably estimating that when Moses arrived in Midian 40 years before, that he would have been, he was around 40 years old. We know that. But when he gets to Midian, we're assuming that Zipporah was about that same age. So the chances are that because of that, Zipporah's father, Jethro, is maybe somewhere around 100 years old. So he is in a position of that would be a position that would be respected by someone like Moses, not just because he's his father-in-law, but because of his age and because of his position as a priest. And so after they greet each other and ask how things are going, they go into the tent, and they talked about all of the things that God had done to deliver Israel from Pharaoh and from the Egyptians. And could you imagine being a fly on the wall in that conversation as Moses is telling Jethro about everything that God had done? And we know from the picture we get of Moses in the text, again, Moses is the one who wrote it, but you love to read the writings of Moses when he describes himself and says he's the most humble man that's ever lived. You read that about Moses, but to listen to him telling Jethro, God did this, then God did that, and God moved in this way, and you should have seen the walls of water. and we walked across on dry ground. You should have seen all of these things. And so he's telling him all of those things, and it would have been an amazing just recounting of God's faithfulness. And so it's believed by some of the biblical scholars, which I thought was kind of interesting. I'd never thought about this before, but I read it in a couple places this week that mentioned that they kind of think that Jethro, although he was the priest of God, or the priest of Midian, there's a belief that he may have been a polytheistic worshiper, meaning that he worshiped multiple gods, not just the God of Abraham or the God of Jacob or Israel, I guess. And it's because of his comment in verse 11 where he says, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods." Now, you can read into that a couple of different ways. He's just like, well, the Egyptians have their gods, but this God, the God of Abraham is just greater. Or it could be that he served a lot of gods, and he's like, wait a minute, now I realize because of what Moses is telling me, he's the most powerful God. We don't know with 100% certainty that he was a polytheistic worshiper, but it's believed that when he heard about what Yahweh had done for Moses and the Israelites, he quit worshiping those other gods. That if that was the case, then he sees God, Yahweh, for who he is and starts only worshiping him. And so during this conversation, we find that Jethro was overjoyed at the thought of what God had done for the Israelites. And I mean, that's amazing, not just because of what God did for his son-in-law, but for what God did for the Israelites. He was overjoyed about that. And so Jethro is at the point where he is, again, if he was polytheistic before this, now he is monotheistic. And so he comes prepared, and he wants to sacrifice a burnt offering to God as a sign of worship. And so he does that. He offers a burnt offering, having this time of worship for God. And following the sacrifices, we find from the scripture that Jethro ate a meal with Moses and Aaron and the elders of Israel in the presence of God, which means that this is before the tabernacle or the tent of meeting. So we're not exactly 100% sure what that means. I never read anywhere this week that described what it meant by in the presence of God. But nevertheless, they have this meal, and it's probably more not just a time of worship that had just happened, but now it's probably more of a recounting of, well, when this plague happened, this is what I saw. And they probably talked more at length about those things. Now, in verses 13 through 18, we see the main part of the story, and this is where Moses sits down to judge the people. And we see that there's a fallacy, there's a brokenness to Moses' method in caring for the people of Israel. So look at verses 13 through 18 with me. It says, "The next day Moses sat down to judge the people, and they stood around Moses from morning until evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw everything he was doing for them, he asked, what is this you're doing for the people? Why are you alone sitting as judge while all the people stand around you from morning until evening?" Moses replied to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. Whenever they have a dispute, it comes to me, and I make a decision between one man and another. I teach them God's statutes and laws." "What you're doing is not good," Moses' father-in-law said to him. "You will certainly wear out both yourself and these people who are with you, because the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone." So the day after this meal, this time of worship, this sharing of stories and everything that goes on, Moses took his place and sat down to judge the people as their arbiter. I mean, that's basically what he was. He was basically working as the referee between the people of Israel, judging between them. And we're told in the scriptures that he did this from sun up to sundown, that this was an all morning, from morning to evening type thing. And now think about this. With somewhere between 2 to 3 million Israelites, you can imagine that Moses never got a break. He never would have had an opportunity, because with that many people, there would constantly be a constant flow of issues of people coming to him, wanting him to judge between them so that they could get an answer. But Jethro wisely asked Moses why he was the only one sitting as judge over the people all day, day after day. Why are you the only one doing this? And that was a wise question from this elderly statesman in Moses' life, not just his father-in-law, but this man with more years of experience and wisdom. And so Moses' answer was that he was the only one they could come to for God's answers to their problems. That was essentially his answer. And Moses used those opportunities when people would come and ask him to referee between them, so to speak. He would use that as an opportunity to teach them God's laws, what God expects of them. And remember, this is still prior to the giving of the law. This is still prior to that. So Moses is being approached by these two people, and they hear the stuff that's going on, and Moses may have had to step away and inquire of God how to answer, or how he would want them to basically solve this problem. And so he used those opportunities to teach them what God expected of them. Now, he probably hoped that as he taught the people God's laws, then they would become less and less dependent on him. As they learn this situation, the next time it shows up in somebody else's lives, they can say, hey, I know what Moses is going to tell you. This is what he's going to say. And that was probably what he was hoping would happen. Excuse me. But see, that was probably Moses' hope, was that, the trickle-down effect. As I tell one, they'll sort of share it, and it'll get spread out to some degree. But Jethro saw it another way. Basically, he saw that what Moses was doing was not sustainable. It couldn't last, because it just wouldn't work. Because what would happen is it would wear Moses out, and the people would be worn out by it as well. Now remember, Moses is 80 years old, and sitting there for hours on end is not going to be easy for him. And so he's going to be wore out, and he's going to wear down. The people are going to be wore down because they're standing in line waiting for Moses to get through, refereeing between these people. And so eventually they're going to wear down and give out by it as well. And so with all of this going on, Jethro's wisdom was going to be, beneficial to not just Moses, but also to the people in Israel. So Jethro's wisdom is sort of summed up in those last few words in verse 18, when he says, the task is too heavy for you. You can't do it alone. That's the key thing that Jethro is trying to get Moses to understand, is that what the task that needed to happen, they needed arbiters, they needed referees, they needed judges. There's no doubt about that. But as Jethro points out, the task was too much for one man for 2 to 3 million people to judge between them, and he couldn't do it alone. And so Jethro, like any good father-in-law, steps in and says, here, son-in-law, here's what I think you ought to do, right? Well, he does give him some wisdom, right? And so we see his advice in verses 19